all the teachers are smart. Most of them quit and went to other schools. But the hired new teachers are still getting exposed. And the really bad news is the kids who went to school there for 3 years are now dropping like flies. And nobody would do anything. California won't do anything. The teachers went to their union. There's 270,000 people, California teachers in the union. There's a study done in 1989 by Peggy Reynolds. They got exactly the same cancers in excess in all these teachers in the whole state. So I've written 4 or 5 letters to the leadership of the union, talked to their attorneys. Big stonewall. Nobody wants to do anything or will do anything. We tried to get lawsuits. Can't get attorneys to take this on. Okay, so I don't know. Here, the California Teachers Association supports it. You know, I was always curious in my occupational stuff in Washington State. Why do office workers have all these cancers? Why do indoor workers have melanoma higher than say, the sailors who have a lot of solar exposure? It's not the sunshine, it's dirty electricity. It's this stuff. So with this under my belt, I decided to go back and revisit the adult cancers. And that's this paper. I got some copies here for you. And this is another mind blower. I just couldn't believe this. There's what it looks like. If you don't read anything else, just read the summary. It says it all. Now, if electrification data from the census was available for 30, 40, and 50. And what's really sad is that I'd hoped to be able to go back and do the childhood leukemia stuff in electrified versus non-electrified farms instead of aggregate state data. They have a 70-year, what do you call it, quarantine on the data. So the genealogists can't get in to the 30 data to 2000. So in 2000, I wrote them and called them, and they said, sorry, somebody lost the data or ruined it, or got rid of it. So there's no 1930 farm data. The farm schedules were just tossed. So forget about that study. So anyway, we got an estimate of percent of homes in each state served by electricity in 1940. I looked at 30, I looked at 20, but 1940 was the first time that they separated occurrence and residence. There's a problem, like people from the countryside go to the city and die. You don't know whether, if they got counted as urban, you lost their rural residence. So, but they had that all figured out by 1940. So that's basically the same graph that Osibel published. It just shows you another line. You can't read that, but it shows for 1930 and 1940, each of the states, the percent of residences that had electric service. And in the books I looked at that were 60 years old, they had these wonderful graphs I had to copy for the paper. Here's the all-causes death rate from 1900 to 1960. You notice that big bump at 1918, you can guess what that was. That was influenza. But what's interesting is that was coming down basically because public health people learned to put feces and urine in pipes and to clean up the water. So people weren't dying of enteric disease, and they learned about immunization and how to take care of TB. But this is really scary. Here's the cancers from 1900 forwards. Electrification began in big cities back in 1900. There's cardiovascular renal disease. There's diabetes. The big break is due to a code change. Okay, so the study was basically to we looked at urban and rural residents' mortality. And what we saw is the urban rate and deaths per 100,000. You can see the urban rate and the rural rate. And the last column is percent urban excess. In 1940, all causes was 20% higher in urban areas. The cancers were 50% higher. In 1920, it was 60% higher. In 1910, it was even higher. So things were evening out as electrification was spreading. Heart disease, 33% higher in the cities. Other heart disease, 33%. Diabetes, 66% higher. Can you believe that? This is mortality. This is deaths. Suicide, that was a big surprise. There are 2 or 3 papers in the EMF literature linking suicide with EMF. Motor vehicle accidents, nothing. I hate this slide, but there's no way of doing it. What I did is I did correlations. You see, in the cities, In the urban areas, there's very little variation. In the highly electrified states, urban and rural are pretty much the same. But out in the countryside, the rural areas, it depended on the progress of electrification in their state. Some states were ahead, others were behind, like Mississippi and Alabama. And what you see is that the correlations, the rural correlations are always higher than the urban ones, and they're almost all statistically significantly correlated. And I've got nice spot graphs for all of these, but I couldn't put 40 in the paper or 20 in the paper. So a good trick looking at complicated distributions is to look at the tails. These are the highly exposed, like Rhode Island, Massachusetts. That's percent residential electrification, are all over 90. Those states, Georgia, South Carolina, Alabama, blah, blah, blah. Urban and rural. Look at the systematic differences. This is death rates, mortality. Look at the urban rates in the low electrification states. Every one is systematically higher. Here there's not so much difference because the rural areas of these states are pretty much like the urban areas. That's all causes. Here's cancers. If that isn't as clean as a whistle, that's just amazing to get that kind of regularity of data. Up here you don't see much difference, but look at the difference between, say, the rural rates in Georgia and the rural rates in the electrified states. I mean, here's heart disease, much the same. There's diabetes. Look at the, whoops, did it go back? Well, look at diabetes. Look at Mississippi. The rural diabetes rate was under 5. Look at the rural diabetes rate in Rhode Island. It's almost 50, tenfold difference based on where you live. That's fatality, not incidence, deaths from it. This was a surprise. There's systematic differences in suicide, except South Carolina didn't seem to fit the pattern, but you got to show all your data. And I'll end with this one here. There's the spot graph. Each one of these dots is a state. There's the trend line, and that's suicide death rate per 100,000 against percent electrification of residences by state. You see the urban trend is flat. The rural is significantly up. Now, I've got those graphs for all the causes. If anybody wants them, I could just email them to you. Okay, so my conclusions, urban death rates are higher for heart disease, cancer, diabetes. Rural death rates are correlated with residential electric service. And I hypothesize that the 20th century epidemic of the so-called diseases of civilization, including all those diseases, is caused by electrification, not by lifestyle. Now, why I say that is, think of a lifestyle variable: diet, exercise, eating Cheetos, going to McDonald's. I mean, how could they cause all the cancers, all these other things to go up? I mean, how could they cause melanoma increase that's happening? No way. The only environmental exposure I know that gives you all cancers is ionizing radiation. And this is part of the same spectrum, and I think it's working the same way. And I think it's the dirty electricity. And I can try to demonstrate in a few seconds why that works. The good news is a large proportion of these diseases are therefore preventable if society chooses to do it. But like I tell the wife, I'll be long in my grave before anybody does much about this. And I'm convinced that right now we're in the midst of another epidemic caused mostly by RF, radio frequency. You get infantile diabetes at rates that never happened before. You get juvenile asthma is going up like a shot. Many cancers are going up over 5 to 6% per year, melanoma, thyroid. So no place to hide anymore, and electrosensitives will tell you that too. It stinks.
We're going to have questions.